All right, so today we've got the highly anticipated 2025 Zephyrus G16 from Asus. A lot of it's the same as last year, but some stuff has changed. So I'm gonna cover a lot more than the typical reviewer because just about everybody has left out a lot of critical details on this guy. So let's get into it. So I have the RTX 5070 Ti model right here and the RTX 5090 model right here behind me, but I'll also give you an idea of how the 5080 model will perform as well. So that way you can be pretty informed no matter which one you get. And the most notable option really is the RTX 5070 Ti model, so stick around to hear more about that one. And then other specs, it's got the new Intel Core Ultra Lunar Lake 285H CPU. And I know CPU naming schemes can be really confusing, especially in 2025, but it's really important to distinguish this as an efficient CPU, all right? Which means it does really good in low wattage and battery scenarios. So unlike the HX counterparts that you see in laptops like the Legion 7i or Omen Max, they're all called Core Ultra as well this year, which makes things really confusing. But yeah, just remember H is for battery life and HX is for power, at least for Intel. Now these have 32 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM, which is soldered, and you can get it as low as 16 gigabytes depending on the model that you get, or you can get it as high as 64 gigabytes. So this year it's a little bit harder to be mad about it being soldered since you have up to 64 gigs configurable. I just wish they were more customizable, like you really got to go out of your way to get that 64 gig option. But the 5070 Ti model in the US having 32 gigs is a pretty big win compared to like the 4070 model from last year, which was stuck with 16 gigs. Now for ports, we have HDMI 2.1, so 4K 120Hz output, right? Directly from the GPU, which allows G-Sync to your monitor. You get the power jack right here. You get Thunderbolt 4 with DisplayPort 2.1, which is an upgrade over the previous 1.4 that's still seen in many other laptops. So much higher bandwidth coming out there. This port runs through Optimus on this side, so it hits the integrated graphics first before it hits the GPU. This means that you don't get any G-Sync out of this port. But if you're editing video on a monitor or something, this actually is helpful because you can keep Intel QuickSync active. Or if you're connecting to a monitor on battery, this doesn't let it drain as fast as connecting to like the HDMI port. Next is your USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 and then your audio jack. On the other side, you get USB-C 3.2 Gen 2, which connects directly to the NVIDIA GPU on this one. So G-Sync out, DisplayPort 2.1, all that fun stuff. You get another USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 port, and then you get a full-size UHS-2 SD card reader. But keep in mind that card will stick out a little bit, as they do on most SD card reader laptops like this. Also, both USB-C ports support power delivery 3.0, so anything like a 20 volt 5 amp charger that can supply up to 100 watts will work on both sides. And I'll show how that affects performance later. And my personal favorite USB-C chargers for the Zephyrus laptops are the ones from Ugreen, who have actually sponsored this video. So this is the Ugreen Nexode 165 watt retractable power bank. It's a really compact travel charger, especially considering it has a 20,000 milliamp hour capacity, which for reference is enough to charge like an iPhone 16 up to 3.8 times according to them. And it meets airline standards, so you can even bring this on a plane. What I like about it, it has 165 watts of total power output. So you can get that 20 volt 5 amp that I was talking about, true 100 watt output out of either one of these USB-C ports. And if you're using both, it's 165 watt split. That's enough to charge a 14-inch MacBook Pro from 0 to 54% in just 30 minutes. And of course, you also have a USB-A port, so you can charge up to 3 devices at the same time. What I really like though is the retractable cable. So not only did they send me their 100 watt retractable charging cable, which also a huge fan of, but this power bank has its own little built-in retractable USB-C cable, 0.65 meters long, which makes it great for just keeping things neat. And they really build these to withstand like wear and tear. They do 25,000 retraction cycles and 10,000 bend tests just to ensure that this thing's going to be durable for you. Plus, one thing that really stands out is their smart TFT display. So it gives you real-time insights. It actually gives you a lot of data here. So you get, this cute little face, of course, but you also get your remaining battery percentage, how much power is going into the device if you're charging it, how much power is going out from each port. You get your voltage, you get your current, and you can even have a power flow curve, all just from clicking this little side button here. So yeah, this pairs really well with the Zephyrus G14 or G16. And yeah, you'll definitely see me actually using this thing whenever I'm traveling with these guys. Because come on, that just makes everything so clean with these retractable cables. You don't have to worry about wires tangling up or any of that stuff. So anyways, yeah, check out Ugreen's Prime Day deals in the description. I have links where you can get up to 40% off. So definitely go check that out. And thank you so much, Ugreen, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. But yeah, as far as the design goes, I mean, this is easily one of the best looking laptops on the market. It's the thinnest and lightest 16-inch gaming laptop that you can possibly buy. The only one that comes close is the Razer Blade 16, although that one is still like half a pound heavier, and then it's also a tiny bit taller, but almost just as thin as the G16 here, with the G16 having just a slightly thinner display, but a slightly thicker body, so they come out to be about the same. When you add in the charging brick, it really maintains its prominence as the lightest 16-inch gaming laptop because now it weighs even less in comparison than it did to the Blade 16. So, I mean, for travel, like this is still pretty unbeatable in this category. Laptops like the Legion Pro 7i here, or MSI Raider, or HP Omen Max behind me, they look pretty big when you're comparing them to the G16. Trying to carry this in one hand is a very difficult task when it's actually pretty easy to do on the G16. Not only that, but check this out. These big guys also are coming with a 400 watt power adapter this year compared to the 240 watt on the G16. So carrying these in a bag, that only adds more weight and bulkiness. So I find this a bit excessive. Like, it's starting to get a little crazy how gigantic these chargers are getting. Now, obviously I'm a little biased here. I definitely prefer laptops that give more portability, but even in your lap, you know, as the name suggests, something like a G16 is much more easy to use and more comfortable to me. Now, the dark gray color is pretty sleek. I like it a lot. It can attract some fingerprints, like you can probably see some here, but it doesn't do nearly as bad as a lot of the darker laptops like Omen Max, Legion Pro, especially the Razer Blade. Those attract fingerprints way worse than this guy. But there's also like a more silver white color if you want something that doesn't attract fingerprints as much. Now, some people love the slash, some people hate it. It is what it is. You know, you have some lighting effects or you can disable it completely, but I mean, personally, I've grown to like it myself. Also, people completely over exaggerated the hinge wobble last year, but I was a little pleasantly surprised that they actually seem to have tightened the hinges this year. It feels to be a little bit tighter. I mean, if I'm going to put a number on it, like 20% tighter, there is a tiny bit of wobble, but it's really not bad at all. And the typing experience is amazing. Like, this is the same great keyboard that we're used to on last year's model. In my opinion, it's one of the best laptop keyboards, like 1.7 millimeters of key travel that I don't really think feels mushy at all. And that is a tiny bit more travel than the Blade 16 coming in at 1.6 millimeters. But I mean, keyboard feeling is a bit subjective, of course. Like, some people might like the Blades more, some people like Legion more. My favorites over the years have tended to be Asus and Alienware, personally. Also, I still hate the Copilot key, so I recommend using a keyboard mapping software to take back the control key as it should be. And the trackpad is also one of the best out there. I mean, it's roomy, it's made of glass. You know, it's a little excessively big. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, but I don't think people give enough credit for manufacturers who actually put glass trackpads in their $2,000+ laptops. Like, it needs to be the standard. It seriously feels so much nicer to use this compared to the plastic trackpads like on the Legion or the MSI laptops. You know, I'd say the next step from here is maybe haptic, but that's probably a couple of years out, honestly. Alright, G16 webcam. It's pretty good, nothing crazy. Handles light, alright. So internally, it's looking pretty great. I mean, nice big vapor chamber, liquid metal on the CPU, Asus's PTM on the GPU. So if you get a good paste job from the factory, then you're all set here for years to come. Plus, you got 2 SSD slots, and the stock one that it comes with is pretty fast. Now, talking about the display, it's the same one as last year, so we already know how this guy is. It's really good, amazing color accuracy, response times. If you see my review for that one, you'll know this is a great display. It's an OLED QHD display with a 16:10 aspect ratio, so 1600p and 240 Hz refresh rate. Oh, and the reflection handling is the best with the G16 compared to other glossy OLED gaming laptops with this same display. So you can see the difference here when we're looking at the Legion. It's almost like a mirror. And then the Blade, you know, it's pretty reflective still, but the G16 just handles reflections a lot better. Like, I know some people hate glossy displays. I personally love them, and I think this is kind of the best of both worlds. You get really good anti-reflection, but you also get the glossy feel. A couple things things to be aware of though. Somehow I hit like a hotkey to change my color profile to racing in Armory Crate. So, you know, if you ever notice colors look off or something, just go ahead and check game visual every once in a while in GHelper or Armory Crate, because you might have done the same thing. Also, make sure you turn off Windows auto color management in case it's enabled by default by Windows for some reason. This will make it look a little washed out, so just turn that off. And remember that HDR will look less saturated on the desktop, but when you're actually gaming and viewing HDR content, that's when it actually starts to pop. So this is the exact same display that you're going to be seeing in every other 16-inch OLED laptop on the market. The only one that got a different panel this year is the one from the Legion Pro 7i, which has higher brightness than this one by a little bit, but mostly in a 10% window. So like tiny highlights might pop a bit more on that panel, but otherwise they look about the same. Even if you put them side by side like I did here, when you're watching normal HDR content, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's really hard to find a difference. I mean, I noticed maybe some highlights were popping out a little bit more on the Legion, but some people have really been over exaggerating this. It's really not a big difference. At least not that I could see. Although I am happy that Samsung is improving this panel. I wish more laptops had this second generation version of it. However, the G16's panel is no slouch. We're hitting 740 nits of HDR brightness at a 10% window and a 50% window. So it's maintaining its brightness pretty well. The only time it goes down is at a 100% full white window. You're getting 625 nits, which is still amazing for HDR brightness on a full window screen. Thinking about like other panels at HDR full window, even on some like high-end gaming monitors, you might hit like maybe 300 nits on a full white screen. So yeah, to see 625 nits here, that's pretty crazy. The Legion's was getting a little brighter on a full screen window at 750 nits. So, you know, a decent improvement, but like I said, in content, it is really hard to tell. And if you didn't watch my 2024 G16 review, again, it's the same panel. So I talked about it in that one too, but it has a S-stripe subpixel layout, which is really good for text clarity and burn-in prevention. So there's already burn-in prevention built into the laptop itself, into the BIOS. You have pixel refresh, and by default, it has things like a screensaver that automatically kicks in. So for me personally, burn-in is not a big concern here. This also has 100% DCI-P3 color gamut with less than 1 delta E at 0.85, which is crazy good color accuracy. And then your brightness in SDR goes up to 465 nits. So overall, I mean, this is the laptop display to have. Like, I see why every laptop manufacturer is going towards this one now. It's amazing. And with that anti-reflective coating, I feel like this one is like the best of the bunch. I mean, I would maybe lean more towards the Legions if that display wasn't so freaking reflective. But yeah, overall, I love this panel and I'm happy to see it return. All right, so speakers. So if you've heard last year's speakers, you've heard this year's. They are officially the gold standard laptop speakers as far as I'm concerned. Some people like the MacBook Pro speakers a bit better. Some people like these better. Still, in 2025, like nothing else in the gaming department even comes close. So here's a sound sample to check that out.
These laptop speakers sound good. Do they sound the way that they should? Which one do you think sounds best in this laptop speaker test? Laptop speakers can get around yeah. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
And normally I'd go more in depth on the software here, but it's identical to last year's G16 with just an updated look to Armory Crate. So instead, I'm just going to let it breeze through the options here. One important thing to mention though is manual mode in Armory Crate gives you that extra 10 watts to your GPU. So that's how you achieve the 130 watts or 125 watts on the 5070 Ti. No reviews ever mention that, nor do they test for it, but I'm also going to show me scrubbing through the BIOS real quick to give you a bit of a look at what the options are there as well. And of course, I always recommend GHelper for people who want even more control out of their laptop. You know, you've got dozens of fan curve possibilities, a few exclusive options that aren't available in Armory Crate. I have a whole video for that on my channel, so check it out. All right, so unfortunately, fan noise is where I'm a little bit disappointed with this laptop in comparison to last year, but I think I know why this happened. You'll see here soon when we talk about thermals and wattage that the CPU especially does not run quite as hot as it did on the 2024 G16. I think what happened is Asus probably saw a lot of Redditors and people just worried about their CPU CPU temps, you know, and that's perfectly normal. I mean, this always happens, especially with Intel CPUs. They're sort of designed by Intel engineers to hit 95 degrees safely. You know, that's just how they're made. No matter what people say or disagree with, like, that's just how Intel designed those CPUs to run. So when people saw their CPUs in the 90s, they're freaking out. They're like, oh my God, this, you know, I got to return this laptop. So yeah, I think Asus upped the fan speed across the board to sort of help bring some of those CPU temps down, and it did. But in return, we have louder fans. So the fan noise to time spy graphics ratio chart is how I like to represent how fan noise really is in a laptop, because sometimes you might have really loud fans, but for no actual reason. Like, are you actually getting performance from those louder fans? So I made this chart to sort of help dive into that issue. So we have on the left side here, the light blue bars are how much fan noise in decibels you'll be experiencing. And remember that each decibel of fan noise is about 10% louder. So even 1 decibel can be fairly significant. So we want our fan noise to be lower in decibels, and then we want the dark blue bars here to be higher. This is your time spy graphics score, so your GPU performance divided by how loud the fans are running. So this is how much performance you get for each decibel of fan noise. And of course, we're split up by turbo mode, balance mode, and silent mode here. So you'll see in turbo mode, like the 2023 Blade 16 was just on something else that year. Like, the thing really had well-tuned fans, honestly. At 47.5 decibels, we were staying under 50 decibels on a turbo mode on a laptop. You really don't see that. It seems like every laptop is going over 50 decibels recently. So this is not just a trend with Asus. Even Razer here with the 2025 Razer Blade is now one of the loudest laptops I'd ever recorded at 54 decibels. That can be easily heard from another room over. And then even the new G16 is hitting 52.3 decibels. Again, you can definitely hear this from the room over, whereas the 4090 G16, yeah, I mean, it's only 1 decibel less, but it's kind of noticeable. I mean, that's about 10% less fan noise. So yeah, 385 points per decibel on the 5090 G16, 304 points per decibel on the 5070 Ti. Balance mode is where things start to look a little more sad. Just like the Razer Blade 16 this year, we're hitting 50 decibels in balance mode, and that is just almost inexcusable. Like, that is way too loud for a balance mode. We are now almost 5 decibels louder than last year's G16 in this mode. And yeah, while we're still getting good performance, you know, 362 points per decibel on the 5090, 262 points per decibel on the 5070 Ti. That's the one that's really starting to look bad here. It's now in line with all these 4070 laptops, despite having a GPU that is a lot more performant than those. So I really hope Asus fixes this balance mode. Either way though, I mean, you can fix it yourself with G-Helper. I just wanted to point this out as the stock balance mode. No, like, you should not be able to hear a balance mode from a laptop from the room over. And then sort of the same thing in silent mode. It's not super great here. I mean, the 5090 Blade 16 pulls quite ahead, but it's super loud at 43 decibels. That's like the loudest laptop I've ever had in silent mode. Whereas the G16 is also pretty loud at 40.5 decibels, and now it's below some 4070 laptops like the G14 at 294 points per decibel on the 5090 and 265 points per decibel on the 5070 Ti. Again, these should not be amongst 4070 laptops as far as points per decibel in their silent mode. Yes, you can fix this with G-Helper, but I'm just saying the stock silent mode should not be performing this bad for that much fan noise. But yeah, here's a sound sample of how those sound in comparison to some other laptops. Now, as far as battery life goes, it's an awesome laptop in the battery department. There's this old folk tale, okay, about Intel being terrible for your battery life, but they've got something to say about that, all right? These guys are nearly just as efficient as the new Ryzen processors, and they go head to head in the battery department. People were asking me about a video saying that this laptop had poor battery life, and yeah, I mean, I've put the HX370 and the 285H head to head in a lot of different scenarios, and that just isn't true. The G16 can easily get 9 to 10 hours of battery life, averaging about 9.5 hours for me in YouTube playback. And even doing basic tasks, like you can see the discharge rate here is like -9 to -11 or so. So that indicates, you know, about 8 to 10 hours. And that's with multiple tabs open, switching between tabs, videos playing. So, I mean, that's a really good result for a gaming laptop. And personally, I wasn't finding any major difference between this and the G14 in that department. And the CPU runs at about up to 110 watts, which is pretty good for a laptop this thin. Of course, that's only when it's like a CPU only load, such such as Cinebench R23 here, where we see a score of 21,986, which if you run it at 110 watts, you can actually get it up to 22,849. But again, that's pushing beyond stock limits, because at stock, it likes to run it at around 90 to 100 watts max. You'll see one big improvement over the 185H is actually in the single core performance, which I think actually leads to some of the gaming FPS increases that you're going to see later in the benchmarks, because single core is very important for like a snappy feel, especially when you're on battery or at a lower wattage. You know, of course, we're hitting nowhere near these HX CPUs, but you'll see here in a minute that it matters a lot less than you might think. So stick around. So balance mode, we don't really lose much CPU performance at all here. We're pretty much matching like the HX 370 in the Blade with a little bit better single core performance. And then same thing in silent mode, we're still hitting almost 19,000 Cinebench score in silent mode, which is really good and a decent improvement over last year's 185H, especially again in that single core department. Now on battery, for some reason, I was actually getting better multi-core performance out of the 185H, but yeah, at least we're getting a way better single core performance than like the Blade 16 here, which becomes extremely sluggish due to how low of a score it gets on battery. USB-C power delivery is essentially the same as battery, just about the same exact score there. And then also I like to measure core-to-core latency on these new CPUs, since we had a little bit of an issue that with last year's AMD model, but they did since patch that one. Anyways, the 285H here is hitting 46 nanoseconds, which is a little bit better than the current AMD model, which is hitting in the 60s of nanoseconds like on the G14. So yeah, people love to hate on Intel, and I used to be an Intel hater myself, not gonna lie. But the Intel Core Ultra 285H, I mean, it's a great CPU. Like the only thing disappointing about it is that it's barely better than the 185H. But either way, it's nearly tied with the AMD HX 370, while it offers, you know, more cores. You get 6 P cores, 8 E cores, and 2 low power E cores. Remember, H is for battery and HX is for power for Intel. This is an efficient chip, okay? And I see a lot of misinformation, like people simply just calling this inferior to, you know, something like the 275HX, which you see in thicker laptops. And, you know, technically it is. Looking at the Cinebench charts, it always falls below those. And yeah, keep in mind, I use Cinebench R23 over 24 because R23 is just better at pushing the CPU to its absolute maximum, independently of like other system components like memory. And here it is, you know, one of the most important charts for a laptop that hardly any other reviews even cover. So this is what actually tells the full story about the CPU and why I actually prefer something like a 285H over a 275HX personally. And that's the CPU power scaling. This chart shows you how much performance you get at different levels of wattage. So for efficiency, you want to see your CPU getting the most performance, so high up on the y-axis, while using as little power as possible, being low on the x-axis. This is also where you see battery life improvements, is in this area right here. So desktop users and powerful, thick laptops, you know, they love to push the highest possible wattage for the most power, but in games, when we look at where our CPU is actually running, it's usually around like 30 to 40 watts or so, even as low as 15 to 20 watts on some super thin laptops. And that's where the 285H dominates. You can see it's doing much better here than thicker laptops and just about tied with the AMD HX 370, although that one is still a little better. Neither of them though are nearly as good as the AMD Max 395 Plus, which is my favorite CPU right now, and it beats everything in both power and efficiency, and it blows my mind that it's not in every laptop out this year. Like, huge missed opportunity. But yeah, this is why a lot of people like MacBooks. Like, I'm adding the MacBooks in here. They only run at like 1 wattage, so I don't really have a curve for them, but you can see on the dots here, they tend to stay high up in performance, but at low wattages. Regardless though, I mean, the 285H is a beast at low wattages, and we love to see that, even surpassing some of these MacBooks here at that same level. Now in single core, this is basically just as important because many programs and games are single threaded. You can see the 285H still is doing great here, but you know, this is where MacBooks really dominate, and a big part of why you get so much performance on battery with Mac. The GPU is where, you know, I think most people are going to be conflicted with this laptop, at least at the 5080 and 5090 level. So yeah, I think if you're getting the 5070 or 5070 Ti model, you're going to be super happy with this laptop. The 5070 runs at up to 115 watts, 5070 Ti model runs at 125 watts, and then the 5080 and 5090 run at up to 130 watts, which everyone gets all these wattage numbers wrong on the G16 and G14 because no one actually does the research and finds out that you actually get an extra 10 watts when you're using manual mode or G Helper. So anytime you see somebody who says that this 5080 or 5090 runs at 120 watts, or they say like the 5070 Ti runs at 115 watts, then yeah, you just found someone who didn't do their research and probably ran their benchmarks wrong. So that's why I really like to point that out, because so many reviews mess this part up and it makes the laptop look worse than it actually is. But also Asus probably should have done a better job promoting this, because even some of of their marketing material actually has the lower wattage numbers as well. But the easiest way to confirm it, just open NVIDIA control panel, look at that maximum wattage right there. That's what you're gonna see, especially when you're in a GPU bound scenario. So we're gonna look at 3D Mark TimeSpy graphics score because that is a good gauge of how a GPU performs. I don't usually look at the CPU score much anymore because it really varies and it doesn't really give you accurate results. So really the graphics score is what we're looking at here. And you can see the 5070 Ti is hitting about 15,700 graphics score. And at first glance, that is pretty far behind the 4090, but you're gonna see in some of these gaming performance charts later on that it scores really close to that one in games. So if anything, the graphics score actually makes the 5070 Ti look worse than it really is. This is a really well performing GPU. Like, I mean, just look at it compared to like these 4070s at 140 watts. It's like smoking those. It's finally giving us that bridge between an RTX 4070 or a 5070 and like a 5080 or 4080, 4090. So this is an amazing GPU and like really the best one that I can give NVIDIA credit for this year. Because like when you look at the 5090, you know, we're hitting about 2,000 more graphics score, which is fine, but like that's nowhere near the graphics score jump that we had between, you know, the 4080 and 3080 or 3080 Ti even. Like this is a very weak generational jump when it comes to the 5080 and 5090 GPUs. So a lot of the benchmarks you're going to see are not as big of a generational jump as one might hope, and that is unfortunately NVIDIA's fault. I mean, at the end of the day, like they actually did give us, you know, 5 more watts and a better GPU, so the ingredients were there for a pretty decent upgrade. It was just NVIDIA sort of failed all of us. What's funny here is that the Blade 16 has an extra 2,000 graphics score on top of the G16, yet those two in games actually come very close, which you'll see soon in the gaming benchmarks. And then balance mode, it still does really good at about 18,000 on the 5090 and 13,000 on the 5070 Ti. And then in silent mode, the 5070 Ti still does really good here, hitting almost 11,000, and then the 5090 model actually does not do well in silent mode at all. That's why I recommend using G-Helper, because you can actually achieve nearly turbo mode level performance in silent mode just with a little bit of basic tuning in G-Helper. It's just for this chart I ran it at the stock Armory Crate silent mode. On battery, these do amazing though at over 9,000 graphics score, and then same thing on USB-C power delivery. They're actually pretty much matching the Flow Z13, which is getting like its full performance on USB-C power delivery. And then the same thing goes for integrated graphics. It actually is pretty much top of the charts here with the Intel Arc 140T. Steel Nomad is another GPU only benchmark, and you can see the new G16 is 25% higher here than its 4090 predecessor. And even the 5070 Ti is actually coming pretty close to the 4090. This actually translates better to how these all perform in games, I feel like. Except for, again, the Blade 16 being that far ahead isn't really the case that much. And I also threw in a desktop 4080 here just to give you an idea of like how far we are away from like, you know, pretty high grade desktop performance. It's just these other GPUs like the, you know, full wattage 5080, the full wattage 5090, they just come out a pretty good ways ahead of the 5090 here. But these are just much thicker laptops, much heavier, way less battery life, way less premium features. All right, so I know a lot of you were anxiously awaiting this part, the VBIOS swap. Yes, it works. You can increase the GPU wattage on the G16 if you want. Now, I probably can't legally recommend this because anytime you're modifying something like this, there is going to be some sort of risk. Just because it works perfectly for me doesn't mean it's going to work perfectly for you. So I'm just throwing that out there. But for me, yes, this worked perfectly. I tried a few different VBIOS mods between the one from the Razer Blade, HP Omen Max, Asus Scar. They all pretty much did the same thing. But yeah, they all allowed me to push the GPU up to 175 watts max instead of the stock 130 watts. Now, the laptop itself can't really sustain 175 watts, not without like a cooling pad or something like that to boost the cooling. However, I did find that the temps were good enough, you know, with that increased fan speed. All I had to do was like lift the back of the laptop and I was easily able to run 155, 160 watts with like the sweet spot being around 150. And I think this could be a great alternative for someone like me who typically likes like the Zephyrus laptops more than like Razer Blade, because, you know, the Blade this year had a little bit higher GPU wattage. Even though it doesn't actually hit its rated wattage, the G16 can now surpass the Blade 16 in that regard. And yeah, let's quickly look at some benchmarks here. So with that 175 watt VBIOS, we're now passing the Blade 16 in TimeSpy at over 23,000 graphics score, which is crazy from a laptop this small. Same thing in Steel Nomad, we're actually surpassing 6K in Steel Nomad now, coming dangerously close to that HP Omen Max here. And then even in games, you see a pretty decent jump, not just in benchmarks. So Shadow the Tomb Raider, for example, we go from 157 FPS to 171 with the VBIOS swap. We're now getting 12 more FPS than the Blade 16 in this one. In Forza, that takes us from 133 FPS to 149 FPS, pretty much matching the Blade 16. In Cyberpunk, we don't get a huge boost here, 74 FPS to 79, but again, surpassing the Blade 16. If we use the Ultra setting instead, which is actually more GPU bound, you see a nice little jump here from 101 to 117 FPS. Now we're way ahead of the Blade and approaching HP Omen Max territory. Black Myth Wukong go from 73 FPS to 83 FPS, surpassing the Blade by a decent margin and coming close to the HP Omen Max. Black Ops 6 going from 99 FPS to 108, so pretty much matching the Blade here. And then lastly, I did Horizon Zero Dawn going from 137 FPS to 148, so surpassing the Blade by a little bit on this one. And keep in mind, even maxed out fans are still quieter than the Blade 16's turbo mode. So yeah, I mean, it's gonna be loud, but if you do the necessary things to get the cooling right, if you are a person who likes to tune, this VBIOS swap might be worth checking out. I mean, I can't tell you legally to do it, but what I can say is that for me, this was a game changer for this laptop. Part of the reason why I would decide to keep this over the Razer. And keeping the temperatures in check wasn't as hard as I thought it would be either. But yeah, looking at like the manual maxed out fans mode versus the VBIOS swap, you're looking at like 5-6 degrees higher on the CPU and like 7 degrees higher on the GPU. But that's at 35 more watts than it's running at in this benchmark. So I'm honestly shocked that, you know, we're getting like 155 watts and we're really not throttling. And you can do things to sort of offset that temperature there. You can do some GPU undervolting, although that can get, you know, a little bit more advanced. But again, with G-Helper, you can set wattage limits, you can undervolt the GPU, you can set a GPU temperature limit. So there's a lot you can do to sort of mitigate those temperatures if desired. But to me, I was perfectly fine with the GPU being around this range, especially for an extra 35 watts. And, you know, we're getting about 13 FPS more. And like, even though the average FPS doesn't look like it's that much better, if you look at the FPS on real time, you can see it's like around 10 to 15 more FPS in a GPU bound scenario like the second scene of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. And the cool thing with the VBIOS swap is actually you can still run it at stock wattage if desired, either in G-Helper or Armory Crate. And then if you want to push past those stock limits, you just use G-Helper to push that GPU wattage higher. It'll automatically detect that you have a VBIOS swap in there and show you that additional wattage on the GPU tab. And then as far as actually doing the swap, I have a whole video for this on my channel if you are interested. However, sadly, this did not work on the 5070 Ti model. I tried a few different VBIOS swaps and I could not get anything to make this thing run over the stock wattage no matter what I did. So I'm sad to report that you're not going to hit 140 watts on the 5070 Ti unless there's a VBIOS out there that I have not found yet, because unfortunately when I was doing this there was only like 4 or 5 out there to try, so take from that what you will. But yeah, I can't say with certainty that you're going to get more performance from that model in particular. However, the 5080 and 5090 should be exactly the same in how much performance they're able to get extra from a VBIOS swap. Now unfortunately, VBIOS swapping typically always has some sort of downside, such as losing a DisplayPort output or something of that nature. And yes, that does happen here. You actually will lose display output on the right USB-C port until you flash back to the stock VBIOS. Now you can still charge with that port, you just will not get your NVIDIA GPU output of that port. However, you still can get an NVIDIA GPU output from the HDMI port, and then of course you can get your Optimus output from the left USB-C port for a monitor. So, however, the worst downside, unfortunately, is you're gonna lose G-Sync on the internal display of the laptop. So someone pointed that out to me. I actually didn't even notice it, but that is kind of a bummer. I mean, if you're hooking up to an external monitor, not a huge deal, but if you're gaming off the laptop display, yeah, not having G-Sync might lead to some screen tearing. So temperatures and wattage, you know, this is super important. This is how this laptop handles the power that has been supplied to it, you know, what it does in each performance mode. A lot of people like to only cover, you know, how a laptop performs in turbo mode, but like, let's be real, not everyone uses their laptop at full fans 24/7, especially if you're playing around other people or if you're in a different room or whatever. So we're going to look at, you know, all the performance modes at once here, and I'm going to compare them in a GPU bound scenario. So think games like, you know, Cyberpunk, Red Dead Redemption, things that push your GPU. And then we're going to look at it in a CPU bound scenario. So think games like Valorant, Counter-Strike, stuff like that. And I sort of simulate that here with the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark at the highest settings and then the lowest settings. So when you're playing GPU bound games, yeah, manual mode gives you that extra 10 watts on the GPU. A lot of people miss this, and it's kind of crazy that a lot of reviewers don't even see this, because look at the performance difference. You know, in real time, the FPS is about 5, sometimes even 10 FPS higher just from that extra 10 watts going to it. So that's crazy, right? If reviewers are leaving this out, and a lot of them are. So anyways, GPU power, you know, we're hitting about 118, 120 watts right here in this first part. And then, you know, the wattage on the CPU is pretty much in the 20s across the board. And then the second scene gets a little bit more GPU bound, down. But yeah, looking at GPU power across the board, you know, about 120 watts. It can reach 130, like if you're at like 4K or like super ultra high res, you know, GPU bound games. But for the most part, you're going to see about 120 watts, which is not bad. A much better case than the Blade 16, which is rated for 160 watts and only runs at like 130. So, you know, you're only hitting like 10 less than the rated wattage here versus the Blade hitting like 30 less than its rated wattage. Turbo mode's hitting, you know, 110 watts, balance mode's hitting about 100, 105 watts, and then silent mode is hitting a measly 55 watts, which is why later I'm going to recommend G Helper to fix that, because you can see the performance goes down by half if you look at the FPS between balanced and silent mode. As far as temperatures go, you know, we've got our GPU across the board is looking good. I mean, mid 70s. For the most part, it might touch like 80 degrees on the turbo mode and balance mode, but for the most part, like in silent mode, it's in the low 70s, manual mode, it's in like the mid 70s. So really good GPU temps, especially for the wattage that you're getting. And then your CPU, you know, you're hitting like in the 20 watts range across the board. This CPU runs quite a bit cooler than the 185H did in this benchmark. So you can see we're hitting like upper 70s, low to mid 80s. And that's really, really good for an Intel CPU, because a lot of these are designed to hit like 95. And it might, you know, of course, during like a loading scene. But yeah, in game to see CPU temps this low from a G16, man, that is a sight to see. So let's switch over to CPU bound, right? So this is going to push that CPU wattage, and it's probably going to push the CPU temps. So now we're hitting, you know, like 60 watts of CPU power in manual mode, which is really high. And we're still not actually hitting 90 degrees. I mean, we're getting close, but like, you know, mid 80s in manual mode on the CPU, while the GPU is using less than 80 watts. Low to mid 80s on the CPU in turbo mode, with it using like 35 to 50 watts or so. Balance mode, it'll peak at about 50 watts, but it does eventually settle to about 30 watts. And then same thing with silent mode, it'll peak at around 40 watts and then settles at about 30. Overall, I never actually saw the CPU hit 90 degrees other than like maybe in loading sequences, but yeah, this is a really good improvement in temps here from the G16. Of course, the fans are running higher than last year's, but I mean, hey, like, you know, if you want to see those temps lower, then there's sacrifices you got to make. And by the way, I know I'm only showing the 5090 G16 here, but it should be about the same no matter which model you get. In fact, the 5090 is actually probably going to run slightly warmer than most because it has extra wattage going to it. There's like this misconception that a higher tier GPU will run warmer than a lower tier one. That's not really true. Like a 5090 at the same wattage as a 5070 is still going to run at the same temperature. But because this one does have like 5 more watts going to it, and sometimes hits like 10 more watts going to it in a given scenario, so you actually do get slightly warmer temps on the 5080, 5090 G16 than you will on the 5070 Ti. There's also going to be a little bit of lottery on your CPU factory paste. So my 5090 model runs a few degrees warmer on the CPU than my 5070 Ti one here. And I think it's just because the 5070 Ti got a better factory paste job, because otherwise they should be exactly the same. And then to give you my recommended settings, this is especially going to be helpful for silent mode since the stock one is trash on this laptop. So you're going to use G Helper, or you can replicate this in Armory Crate. But yeah, essentially what I do here is I up the fan curves just a tiny bit just to allow it to hit this higher GPU wattage that I wanted to hit. You can experiment with the CPU power limit. I lowered it here to 25 watts, but you can even go as low as like 17 or 18, depending on, you know, the temps that you're desiring or the game that you're playing. Lower the GPU power and dynamic boost all the way down. What I found to work best though was setting like a clock limit of around 1300 to 1400, and this might depend on the game again, so this could take some trial and error. Might not even be worth setting one. And that GPU clock range is what allowed this GPU to run like in the 70 to 80 watt range, at least right here in Apex Legends, which in silent mode led to temps that were, you know, in the upper 70s, low 80s, but it wasn't throttling. And that's what I was really after, was like above that 55 watt stock silent mode, but still getting great performance. And yeah, I was able to achieve that here. Better balance mode, all I did really was raise the stock fan curves just a little bit and then lower them on the top end just a little bit, because I find balance mode at the top end to be way too loud. So yeah, like I did like 4400 RPM, and then just like in silent mode, I actually lowered the GPU wattage all the way down, because I mean, that's still a fair amount of wattage. It can hit up to 100 watts this way still. And then for a better turbo mode, I just make sure that I max out those GPU wattage sliders. I like to give it a good overclock. You know, you can start with like 150, but you could easily hit like 250, even 300 on these 50 series GPUs actually is pretty stable compared to 40 series. And I typically don't mess with the power limits on turbo mode. I like to let it just dynamically run as it needs. But if you want to set them lower, higher, then feel free to do that there. Just don't go too low because you might end up getting unstable. The biggest thing with turbo mode is just really getting that GPU wattage as high as possible and getting that overclock in there. That's where you're going to see the most increase in performance. The CPU, you can just let it ride and leave that box unchecked. All right, so I think creators are going to love the new G16. There's some improvements in some areas. Video editors, I think, are going to see the biggest improvement. But yeah, let's get into it. So Photoshop, not much improvement there, right? It's like pretty much just in line with most other laptops around that 4080 level. You can see there's barely a difference between 5070 Ti and 5090 in this benchmark, and that's because this is a very CPU heavy benchmark. That's why these really efficient CPUs usually come out ahead here, and for some reason Ryzen HX CPUs just dominate in Photoshop. Like, it's just always been that way. And that's pretty much the same case whether you're in balance mode, silent mode, or on battery. You can see those scores are pretty much in line like they were plugged in. Premiere Pro is where you start to see some of the benefits of the 50 series, because the 50 series GPUs are built to handle 422 10-bit and H.265 natively. So that's why you see a decent jump here over like even 175 watt 4090 from last year, even with the 5070 Ti G16 beating out like the Legion Pro 7i, which was a much thicker and more powerful laptop. And they do lose a little bit of performance in their balanced and silent mode, but the 5070 Ti G16 is killing it on battery. And then for some reason, the 5090 G16, I just could not get it to perform well on battery in this benchmark. I don't know why, just this benchmark in particular, but yeah, it was around like a 4070 level on battery. Now, DaVinci Resolve takes a good bit of CPU and GPU, but it does have that 422 support now in DaVinci Resolve 20. So you can see that definitely gives a big boost to some of these newer laptops here, hitting close to 10,000 or more, such as the G16 hitting over 10,000 in this benchmark, which is a great result. 5070 Ti is not far behind at 9,700, actually a little bit ahead of the 5080 G14, which is kind of crazy here, but I think that could be due to some Intel QuickSync magic happening in the background. In balance mode, the 5090 is still doing great, same with the 5070 Ti, and then in silent mode, 5090 is still doing pretty good, but the 5070 Ti does lose a good bit of performance here. However, they're all still doing better than 40 series laptops in these benchmarks. The same thing can be said on battery, where we're still hitting over 6,000, and the 5070 Ti model actually comes out the highest at over 7,000, and then still pretty great in silent mode on battery. And I've also been starting to do USB-C power delivery in this benchmark to give you kind of an understanding of how it'll handle most creative tasks on USB-C power delivery. And you can see it does really well here, top of the charts, even better than like this thicker Legion Pro 7i, which I'll have more benchmarks for soon. And then for my music producers out there, I like to do an Ableton Live benchmark because it gives you an idea of how it's going to do in music applications, as this is a very intensive program, and you can run this on your laptop at home to see how it compares by just downloading the Ableton demo and running the free demo session that's included. So we want to see a lower CPU percentage here for better performance. And this is actually one of the best results I've ever seen, pretty much staying in the teens the whole time, whereas I've seen a lot of laptops, such as last year's G16, hit in the 20% here. So really impressive results, staying around like 14-15%. And this is a very heavy song with a lot of tracks and a lot of effects on it. Same thing with the Ableton 12 benchmark, again around 15-16%. Amazing result. Another thing music producers, and then just anyone using this laptop, I think is going to enjoy the latency mon results here. I did notice that if you're in the DGPU mode, ultimate mode, or NVIDIA GPU only, it does actually have a little bit higher latency versus whether you're in just the regular hybrid or Optimus mode. So most of you, when you're browsing and stuff, it's going to be in hybrid mode automatically. So this is around what you can expect, which is a great latency mon result. It's kind of rare to see good latency mon on Windows laptops recently, so I was pleasantly surprised here. All right, so gaming performance. So, a lot of people are curious how this compares to last year's model, and you'll see that in the charts here, as well as how it is compared to other 5080 or 5070 Ti laptops or 4090 laptops. And I'll try to give you a good idea of where it falls in comparison to, the 5080 model of this same laptop. If you skipped over the GPU section of the video, I recommend going back to that so you can see where it falls on the time spy graph and how that sort of gauges where it will tend to fall in games as well. So I'm going to start with Apex Legends here. This is a game that likes a lot of CPU power, and the 5090 model actually surpasses the Blade 16 in this game at 267 FPS, and the 5070 Ti model is surpassing the 4090 model actually just about neck and and neck with it at around 217 FPS. So we're actually seeing pretty big gains in this game from year over year. And then in balance mode, it's still doing really good around 236 FPS. So keep in mind, so wherever you see like the 5080 G14 on these charts, the 5080 G16 is going to be like maybe 2 or 3 FPS ahead of that. So it's almost like a halfway point between the 5070 Ti and 5090. So just keep that in mind as we go through these charts. But as we go through these charts, you're going to see a pattern where this Omen Max 16 really surpasses the G16, and that is the full fat 5090 running at 175 watts. You know, Black Myth Wukong right here is getting 89 FPS on the Omen Max, 73 FPS on the G16, and then 56 FPS on the 5070 Ti model. So one pattern you might see with the 5070 Ti model is it actually matches like the 4090s of the Zephyrus G16 from last year pretty well in a lot of games. Also, this is another one where it's like neck and neck with the Blade 16. So again, we're not really seeing that extra 30 watt benefit out of the Blade here. Now, Black Ops 6 does like itself some CPU, and you can see like the Omen Max and Legion Pro are killing it in this one. The 5090 G16 hits about 100 FPS, about on par with like 150 watt 4090 from last year, but still about 15% better than last year's G16 here. And then the 5070 Ti model is like, you know, a little lower than the 4090 model here, but still not bad. Same thing in balance mode. The gap between this and the higher powered ones actually lowers quite a bit at 91 FPS, and the 5070 Ti model is falling a little bit more behind in balance mode, but still not a bad result. Now, Cyberpunk is the one game that I run the most benchmarks on because this game can tell you a lot about a laptop. Everything from CPU to GPU power, this benchmark really has it all with all the presets that are in it, which I have my settings at the top here in case you want to run this on your own. But yeah, on the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, this is again, like you see this 5090 just destroying the other laptops. There is a decent amount of CPU needed even on this benchmark because of DLSS. So you can see the Blade 16 and the G16 are really close right here at the 5090 level, and the 5070 Ti is about a little less than the 4090 model of like the G14 and G16. And in balance mode, the G16 does fall a little behind, you know, like the 4090 G14 here. And then in silent mode, the Blade 16 and Omen Max do really well, whereas the 5090 is pretty much at the same level 5070 Ti here. Keep in mind though, the silent mode I'm running at is the stock silent mode with Armory Crate. You can easily surpass this with G Helper. Like I could probably hit like almost the same amount of FPS as balanced or turbo mode in silent mode with the G16 thanks to G Helper. Now the Ultra preset, for some reason the Omen Max just dominates on this one, but you can see again the Blade 16 and G16 are pretty much neck and neck. You would never believe that there was a 30 watt difference between the two, but again, that's because the Blade 16 does not run at its rated 160 watts. It's actually much closer to what the G16 runs at, so it's actually not as much of a surprise once you see the wattage numbers in action. But yeah, 101 FPS, we're getting a pretty good lead over the G16 from last year, and even the 5070 Ti model is pretty much matching the 4090 G14 and surpassing the 4090 G16. The Ultra preset was one where the VBIOS got a huge upgrade on the G16, almost putting it close to where the Omen Max is hitting and way past the Blade 16. In balance mode, again, still pretty neck and neck with the Blade 16 and G16. We're quite a bit ahead of the 5080 G14 and 4090 G14 and 4090 G16. So balance mode is looking good here. Silent mode, they all kind of fall to around that 60 FPS or less level. Now, Ray Tracing Overdrive, you're seeing it hit 93 FPS. Blade does come out ahead here, but we're still surpassing the 5080 G14 by a decent amount. The 5070 Ti G16 is again matching the 4090 G16. It's like they're almost the same exact GPU or something. And then in 4K is where you pretty much rely almost completely on the GPU, and you can see here it's almost like a staircase downward. The more wattage you have, the better it does. So about a 13 FPS difference between the 5070 Ti G16 and the 5090 G16. But this is where that VRAM from the 4090 is actually letting it surpass that 5070 Ti G16 by a little bit. Also, don't be scared, but I'm going to throw in some frame gen numbers here. This is one of the benchmarks I run frame generation on, and this is where things can get a little crazy. So don't feel like you have to read all of this. I'm going to point out the significant ones here. So the most significant data point I would say here is if you're someone who doesn't care about frame gen, you actually see it as a tool, you actually like the idea of it. Very cool data point here is that the 3x frame gen out of the G16 still surpasses the 4x frame gen out of the 5070 Ti G16. So if that is a heavy use case for you, that is something to consider, because I actually used to be a frame gen hater, and I hate that is still a gimmick that Nvidia uses every year for their stupid benchmark data, but I found myself really enjoying it, and I would much rather be on 3x than 4x personally. So yeah, I mean, hitting 132 FPS at RT Overdrive on Cyberpunk is just crazy. And that's the same case with the RT Ultra preset. You can see like even the G14 at 4x frame gen is the same as the G16 at 3x frame gen. And again, it's still surpassing the the 4X frame gen of the 5070 Ti model, so that 5090 comes in handy really well once you start throwing in that frame generation. Forza Horizon 5, there actually is a decent difference between the Blade 16 and G16 here. 5090 model is like barely ahead here, falling behind like the Legion Pro 7i 4090, but still a good bit ahead of the G14 5080, and the 5070 Ti G16 is again pretty much on par with the 4090 G16. And then balance mode's looking pretty great. It puts it ahead of some of these laptops, gets it higher up on the charts, while the Blade 16 and Omen 16 still dominate here. And that's pretty much the same case with silent mode as well. Forza is another one I run in 4K, and you can see here we're a little bit behind some of these 175 watt 4090s, which I hate seeing that, but Nvidia did kind of screw us over with barely any change this year. So, you know, you're going to see that unfortunately on some of these charts, but we are surpassing at least like the 4090 G14 and 5080 G14. For some reason, I was getting really low numbers on the 5070 Ti on this benchmark, so I have excluded that one. Helldivers 2 loves itself some CPU power, and you can see that where this is like where the Legion really comes out ahead because it has a huge cross-load potential. But even the G16 is almost matching the Omen Max 16 in this benchmark, which is just crazy. I don't really understand it, but here we are. You know, it's surpassing the Blade 16. It does really well here. Even the 5070 Ti model is surpassing the 4090 G16, so it's looking really good here for all these laptops. Even balanced and silent mode are not bad at all here. So Horizon Zero Dawn, this is one where like the 5090 G16 and 5080 G14 are not too far apart at only 7 FPS apart, even kind of close to like the 4090 G14, but a decent gain still on the 4090 G16. And then the 5070 Ti G16 is, you know, just a little bit behind the 4090 here. So overall, these aren't like great results compared to like the 5080 Legion and 5090 Omen over here. But again, for the size of this laptop, the portability, this is pretty good. That gap, of course, closes in once you're in balance mode. You're much closer to these thicker laptops now. And then once you're in silent mode, the gap kind of widens again because the Omen has an insane silent mode. And then the Blade 16 has an insanely loud silent mode. This is another one I ran in 4K, and you can see the Blade 16 actually has a decent lead here in 4K. Same with the Omen Max and Legion Pro 5080. So it actually isn't super impressive here at 4K on this game in particular. But again, we are still surpassing, again, the 5080. And the 5070 Ti model is once again just a little bit behind the 4090 here in 4K at about 5 FPS less. And for an idea of CPU performance, I ran this in 1080p, where you're looking at about 150 FPS. So a great result, but like you're, you know, like 40, 50 FPS behind like these 275HX laptops that are running their CPUs way higher in a benchmark like this. And then finally, we're at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is like my tried and true. This is like one of my favorite benchmarks out there. This benchmark has some GPU heavy sections, but it also has some pretty CPU heavy sections. So it's a good one for a good balanced load. And you can see the CPU here is kind of what's leading it to fall behind a little bit more than it has in other benchmarks. We're at 157 FPS, pretty much almost tied with the Blade 16 here. One thing I noticed is that they actually don't like to use more than like 20 to 30 watts on the CPU in this benchmark, whereas like the Legion and Omen Max will hit like double that wattage or more on the CPU in the same benchmark, and it really likes that here. So not the best result, but then again, in comparison to like the 4090 models here, you're getting a decent little lead over those, and then the 5070 Ti is just a little bit behind the 4090. In balance and silent mode, that gap again closes, but the Blade 16 pulls a little bit ahead, of course being really freaking loud. One thing I thought was funny though, in this game, the 5070 Ti model actually surpasses the 5090, but only in silent mode. It's another one I ran at 4K, so we can see a little bit more of the GPU bound results here, although it does still have some CPU reliance. For some reason, the G16 does not do super well at 4K on this benchmark, hitting 91 FPS, falling about 10% behind a full powered 4090 from 2023 and 2024. And it's the same case for the 5070 Ti model, falling a good bit behind RTX 4080s and the 4090 G16 from last year. So 1080p, we're relying much more on the CPU, and this is where it comes out one of the more unimpressive results. You can see like all these HX CPUs are far surpassing it here because they're all using a lot more wattage. But again, we're still ahead of the new Blade 16 in 1080p and even last year's G16 as well. Although I'd argue most people aren't going to be playing games at 1080p on a laptop like this. Just thought I would show this for like a CPU bound result. Now on battery, this thing really flies. We're hitting like 87 FPS. The 5070 Ti model is hitting even higher. And yeah, we're like basically leading the charts here other than this Legion Pro, but we're using less wattage than that Legion Pro was in this result. So we're actually doing amazing here on battery. And the same thing can be said for USB-C power delivery. I kind of want to discount the M16 here because it was like actually discharging battery really bad. So yeah, I'd almost really just give it to the G16 for the winner here. 5070 Ti model just barely ahead of the 5090. You actually get the same exact performance whether you're on battery or on USB-C power delivery. So that's great to see. We're actually surpassing the Flow Z13, which has up until now been my leader in USB-C power delivery performance. performance. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 5080 G14. I think this is a bug. That's why it's at the bottom of the list. So hopefully Asus fixes that in the future. And then if you're on integrated graphics, which there's really no major point in doing this, but you'll hit about 36 FPS compared to like around the 40s in FPS on the Ryzen processors. So yeah, in conclusion, this is still like my favorite laptop. Not only is it a great gaming laptop, but it is a great laptop. Okay, this is like essentially an ultrabook and you can game on it really well. It has improvements over last year's 4090 model in pretty much every game. The CPU improvements aren't that much, but it's got great battery life. It's got power when you need it. I think the most disappointing part about it is really the fact that Nvidia didn't really give us much of an upgrade. So, you know, I think this guy comes oddly close to the Blade 16 in benchmarks. And when you throw a VBIOS swap on it, it actually surpasses the new Blade 16 in a lot of games, or it matches it. So I think it does really good. It's a great laptop for people who like to tune settings, but also like to have, you know, portability and power and speakers and battery life. Like there's just things that this guy can do that most other gaming laptops can't. So it kind of takes the best of all worlds. You know, it's not going to perform nearly as well as any other 5090 like the Omen Max 16 that you saw on my charts, but that's not what it's really trying to do. Now, of course, it's not quite the same as like a G14. Like this is still like the portability king for gaming laptops in general, but for 16-inch, this is still pretty crazy. We're talking this guy is thinner and lighter than a MacBook Pro and just about as thin and light as a MacBook Air. So a gaming laptop that's like around MacBook Air levels of thin. Like that's just crazy in 2025. But yeah, pros and cons. Pros, obviously, beautiful display. You've got amazing speakers. You've got great battery life. You've got a glass trackpad. One of the best keyboards on the market. It's the thinnest and lightest gaming laptop in the 16-inch category. So, you know, extreme portability. Like I said before, nearly a MacBook Air. The software situation is really good between Armory Crate and G Helper. You're pretty set with tuning and fan curves, something that you can't really do well on the Blade 16, for example. It's full aluminum, so it feels extremely sturdy. It's got a really efficient CPU that you don't have to run at like 50 plus watts in games because it runs really well at under 50 watts compared to other CPUs. And you got a really good port selection here. So overall, I mean, it's nearly impossible to find a laptop of this balance. Now, the cons are obviously going to be, you know, performance, especially at like the 5090 and 5080 level compared to thicker laptops, of course, you know, as expected. The 5070 Ti model, though, is going to run pretty close to what it's actually rated for. And then the 5060 and 5070 models are going to run exactly what they're rated for, essentially. So those ones do a lot better in the value department compared to the 5080 and 5090. However, you actually do get some decent gains over last year's 4090 model, and you're even surpassing some of the thicker laptops from last year in like the 4080 and 4090 department. This laptop is super easy to do a VBIOS swap on, even though I can't recommend that legally probably, but you know, I found it surpassed a lot of laptops like the Blade 16. Once I did that, you know, I could easily push the GPU to like 140, 150 watts. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a weird one because it's like 130 watts isn't terrible. I'm actually more mad at Nvidia than I am at Asus for that one. So thanks Nvidia for making these like barely an improvement over last year's GPUs. But hey, I mean, I guess they gave us more VRAM if you need that. So that's pretty cool at least. Another con, you know, the fan noise is a little bit louder than last year's G16. So you will have to deal with some fan noise. But you can, like I said, tune this in G Helper Armory Crate to the best of your ability. And it doesn't really destroy temps. I mean, I think they're just trying to make those temps go down in comparison to what last year's would be. So I get what they're doing. But I guess like the last con I would say is like maybe it's too thin. Maybe they went too far. Just like I said last year, I think they could have made this laptop just a little bit thicker. Like they didn't have to do this much. I'd be happy with like 150 watt GPU with just a slightly thicker body. You know, I think they could have really pulled that off well, especially with the vapor chamber and all that. So I don't know, who knows? Maybe next year. They usually let these chassis run for like 2 years before they refresh. So who knows what we'll see in 2026. But overall, I still think this is the best laptop for 2025. Personally, if you're someone who's after a balance of gaming, battery life, portability, you know, all of that stuff, like this guy delivers, really. You will not find something this premium and this portable with this much power anywhere else. I will be making a Razer Blade versus G16 video, and I have some thoughts about it already. I do think the G16 is probably better for most people outside of like a few exceptions. So, you know, I'll go more in depth on that when that comes out, but be sure to subscribe for that. But anyways, like if you've seen my 2024 review, I kind of feel the same way. It's still my favorite laptop. I'm going to be using this as my daily driver. So if you're after a good 16-inch gaming laptop, I can't recommend this guy enough, really. So hats off Asus, great work. You know, obviously there's, you know, slight improvements to be made, and hopefully we see improvements more with like Intel and Nvidia really in years to come, or maybe throw that AMD Max 395 plus CPU in this guy. I mean, this really would have flown if it had that CPU in it. But, you know, you can't have it all. So anyways, thank you so much guys for watching. I will see you all in the next one. Peace.